The reason America joined the war is the fact that North Korea attacked the town of Hansu, South Korea, and the United Nations asked them to withdraw, and they didn't. And they asked them again, and they didn't. So they asked, the United Nations asked 30 countries in the world to send troops to meet the situation. And Harry Truman, being President of the United States, he sent the Air Force and the Navy from the United States, and without action without asking Congress, and it became known as Harry Truman's police action, and that's how it started. And later on, China did join on North Korea's side, and they came in from the north side and tried to cross the Yalu River in conjunction with the North Koreans. Well, I was going to tell you that Yalu River, that was really quite a battle. They knew they were coming. The North or the Chinese were coming in through Manchuria in the north, and the Corps of Engineers set up concertina wire. And I don't know if you know what concertina wire is, but it's like barbed wire, but it's round. It's about 3 or 4 foot in diameter, and they had laid down for miles this concertina wire. They started with 4, then 3, and 2, and 1. They just built a wall with this concertina wire, but the North Koreans or the Chinese came in. They ran as far as they could run, and they'd just hang there or flop over, and they were building a human bridge. And I wasn't there. Some of the buddies that I went through training with, they were up there. And this one guy by the name of Buck Genfit was his name. And I talked to him later, and he says they had 50 caliber machine guns. They had 2 of them going all the time. And he says they had there were 3 guys, so the 2 machine guns, and they had asbestos gloves where they fired for 28 hours straight. And he says he used these asbestos gloves to change the barrels, and they just kept firing. He says they had these 50 calibers set up about, I think he said around 100 yards apart, or maybe 75 yards apart, all the way along that river. And he says we just fired for 28 hours straight, and he says we didn't have time to go to the bathroom. He said it was really intense. And then he says they finally pulled off. They said they retreated. And he said, I don't know how many thousands and thousands of guys they killed in there that night. My role was to make positive identification of the battle casualty with fingerprinting, tattooing, birthmarks, chart teeth, record all wounds, and coordinate the grid coordinate in where the deceased was killed. That was my role. Got to my destination was being in Korea. I was singled out by some officer that there was somebody up there with an MOS that didn't fit, I guess, and they found me on the way to with my unit to the Yalu River, and I was picked up by a Huey helicopter and flown to Seoul, and from Seoul I took a airliner to a military plane to Busan, and in Busan I took a larger plane and flown to Yokohama, and there I got on a train, and I went, I think it was 700 miles south, and I traveled alone on a Japanese train. I was 22 years old, and I was going from the island of Honshu to Kyushu, and which I didn't realize that there's a tunnel under the sea for 16 miles, and we were on a coal burner, and as we got into that tunnel, everything got black, and I just didn't know what was happening. I couldn't speak Japanese at that time or even understand anything, and I just got up and I put my back into a corner, and I had a 45 on my hip, and I put my duffel bag between my legs, and I stood there, and we finally chugged up to a little town called Moji. And at that time, I had to go to the bathroom really bad. And being 22 years old, I, at that time, didn't much give thought to coeducational restrooms. But I looked and looked and finally found one, and then I went in, and I found there were ladies and men in the room, and I did what I had to do. I came out very relieved. And there I had, we retrained, and I went down to the Kokura RTO, and I had a buddy of mine that was eventually worked for me, picked me up on a Jeep, and he took me to our barracks. His name was Bob Huggins. You asked a question, how our remains, how they got to southern Japan. They were flown by C-119 flying boxcars to Oshia Air Force Base in southern Japan, and transported to Kokura, Japan, to our CIU lab. And I was in Korea with a field wire group, and being that I had graduated from the University of Minnesota with the mortician's license, and I was fully licensed in the state of Minnesota, they somehow missed my experience in the States, and they caught it somewhere in a final screening, and I was picked up in Japan, in Korea, and flown to Yokohama and put on a train, and I traveled south to the island of Kyushu, and that was the home of the American Grave Registration Service Group, or the Central Identification Lab that was set up, and they processed all United Nations and especially American casualties. And I arrived there, and the case number was 14,000, and when I left 19 months later, the case number was 46,000. My discharge, I came in through Fort Lewis, Washington. That's where our discharge point was, and we were there for approximately 3 to 5 days, and doing nothing. And we finally were given our muster out pay, which in my case was $147, as I recall. And I didn't want to spend $147 on transportation to get back to Minnesota, so I hitchhiked home. And I said to myself, I'd sooner save that money for beer. And I hitchhiked all the way through, and I got a ride. One of the first rides was an implement dealer that was delivering farm machinery to northern Idaho. And he was a very jovial type of guy, and he got to his point, and I left him, and I started hitchhiking a little further, and I do remember spending a night under a tree that night, and it was nice. It wasn't that cold, and I slept under a tree and got up on the highway and hitchhiked all the way to North Dakota and down through into Fargo someplace, and I got a room and stayed the night, and the next morning I hitchhiked back into Minneapolis, where I went to Minneapolis to the Strong Filling Station, which is Dave and Paul's father's filling station, and I stayed there, and I left my my army bag there, and I said, "Would you bring this home for me?" And I walked out to Highway 5, and I hitchhiked my way to Waconia, and I did get home, and my mother was on the phone, and she was in the other room, and she didn't know who came in. And I sat down at the kitchen table, and when she came around the corner after her conversation was done, she couldn't understand how I got there. And that was how I was discharged.